A 76-point deficit to McLaren, some embarrassing mistakes, and Lewis Hamilton now suggesting his car is slower than teammate Charles Leclerc's. This is not how Ferrari's much-hyped 2025 season was supposed to start. We've only had 3 rounds of a 24-race schedule, but there's already been a season's worth of Ferrari storyline since testing, when all the hype around Ferrari's new super team reached fever pitch. Now, Ferrari has a mighty points and performance deficit to claw back on McLaren, and is currently being beaten to best-of-the-rest positions by Mercedes and Red Bull. It says a lot about its season so far that 4th and 7th place finishes at the Japanese Grand Prix marked Ferrari's biggest points haul of 2025. Hamilton's China sprint pole and victory stand alone as Ferrari's only real highlights, despite the team having made it clear over the winter that starting on the front foot would be essential to fight for the title this year. When the McLarens underdelivered in Japanese Grand Prix qualifying, it was Max Verstappen and Red Bull who capitalised, with the faster Ferrari of Leclerc still over 0.3 of a second adrift. Everyone struggled to overtake at Suzuka, but Leclerc wasn't anywhere close to Verstappen and the McLarens anyway, finishing just short of 14 seconds adrift of the final place on the podium. That continues the trend of the Ferrari drivers not getting anywhere close to the Grand Prix podium this year. And while Ferrari beat Mercedes for the first time this year at Suzuka, that was more down to George Russell underperforming in qualifying than any Ferrari improvement. So what's going so wrong at Ferrari, and is there really a difference between the two cars? Hamilton has made a solid start to life at Ferrari. He's already won a race, albeit a sprint, and been closer to Leclerc from the off than many predicted he would be. There's some tentative early evidence that some of the traits that plagued the end of his Mercedes stint haven't followed him to Ferrari, but there was an all too familiar complaint that emerged at the end of the first weekend where Hamilton was a clear step behind his teammate this year. The balance of power swung between Hamilton and Leclerc in Melbourne and Shanghai, but at Suzuka, Hamilton was clearly the slower Ferrari driver, 0.3 of a second behind Leclerc in qualifying and 3 places behind in the race. But Hamilton claims there's been a bit of a deficit between both sides of the garage on an element of the car across all 3 weekends so far. He claims Ferrari found something on the car that's been underperforming for the last 3 races and is working on a fix. Hamilton says the issue was costing him a 10th per lap, and his somewhat vague comments are very open to interpretation. It would be all too easy to ponder if he is hinting at things not being totally equal across both sides of the Ferrari garage. It certainly has echoes of similarly vague complaints that Hamilton sometimes made when struggling to match Russell at Mercedes. But it would be wrong to definitively take this as an inference that there are parts that Leclerc has on his car that are of a better specification and would automatically make Leclerc faster. Instead, the most logical explanation for what Hamilton is pointing to is the setup divergence that has been taking place across both cars in recent races. At the season opening Australian Grand Prix, as Hamilton got up to speed at his new team, he pretty much relied on Ferrari to lead the way. Then, having learned so much in Melbourne, Hamilton felt confident already in China to do things more his own way, and that instantly paid off with his brilliant sprint pole and victory. But Hamilton and his side of the garage got it wrong when making post-sprint race setup changes, and that led to a difficult Grand Prix where he was slower than Leclerc, despite Leclerc's Ferrari being damaged. Leclerc's weekend went the other way, having initially struggled versus Hamilton before setup changes swung things back in his favour. Things were then further compounded when Hamilton was disqualified from the race after it was found that his plank had worn away too much, a consequence of his ride height being too low. Of course, Leclerc was also disqualified, but Hamilton's disqualification was a direct result of ill-fated setup changes and ride height choices. Fast forward to Suzuka, and Hamilton's setup experiments continued as he once again elected to do his own thing. From Ferrari team boss Fred Vassar's perspective, the differences between the cars of Hamilton and Leclerc come down to driver preference. Plus, Hamilton in particular may be hurt by what's emerging as the key puzzle of Ferrari's 2025 car. We don't know the full extent of the differences between the setups that the Ferrari drivers are running, although it was well known from Hamilton's Mercedes days that he leaned towards running the car as low and as stiff as possible. But he may be unable to do that because of Ferrari's need to avoid a repeat of what happened in China. Ferrari's key challenge appears to be finding a strong balance through the different ride height ranges that come from low and high speed corners, without this then triggering excessive plank wear over a race distance. Further hampering that choice for the perfect setup is that when the car is full of 110 kilograms of fuel for the start of a full-length Grand Prix, the extra weight makes it more prone to bottoming, which then also risks wearing the plank down too much. And looking after the plank is the priority, even if it means sacrificing the perfect setup from a performance perspective. It's lesser a problem for a sprint, where cars have just 40 kilograms of fuel on board, and the plank only has to do 1/3 of a normal race distance. So did Hamilton's Shanghai weekend, where he dominated the sprint but struggled in the Grand Prix with different settings, expose the reality of Ferrari's situation? Has it got a car that is theoretically quick, but only that quick in a configuration that can never be run in full Grand Prix because of the plank issue? Hamilton confirmed that Ferrari had raised its car at Suzuka in response to the China disqualification and talked of an underperformance happening at the rear of the car. Ride height is so critical to this generation of ground effect F1 cars that Ferrari's Suzuka ride height compromises are likely to be a big factor for why it was so far adrift of McLaren and Verstappen's Red Bull. The team currently appears caught facing a tricky balancing act. It's one, as Vasseur points out, that every team faces in this era, with a huge amount of performance to be found if you can get the balance right. In simple terms, the car being too low in China led to Hamilton's disqualification, and the car being too high in Japan led to its lack of pace at Suzuka. Vasseur insists it's not a problem specific to this year's car, saying Leclerc's plank disqualification at Austin in 2023 was similar to Hamilton's China exclusion. Both were the cost of the pursuit of pushing ride height. But one area where this car is different is that the cockpit has been moved further back from the front axle, by about 2.5 centimetres, to allow for better airflow control over the front wheel and into the underfloor. Coincidentally, that change would have been a relief for Hamilton. He was frustrated by the Mercedes cockpit position being too far forward early in this ground effect era. He prefers a more rearward cockpit position that gives him a better feeling for the sensitivity of the car. Ferrari reduced the gearbox casing length to accommodate the more rearward cockpit, and that means the deepest part of the gearbox is now closer to the rear axle than before, so it rises and lowers more directly to the rear suspension. The slight rake of the car appears to allow Ferrari to run a softer rear suspension, which could explain its prowess in slow-speed corners with the increased mechanical grip it would bring. But the rearward gearbox and a unique diffuser that's believed to be targeted at improving low-speed performance could mean a higher rear ride height is required, so the plank isn't ground away too much in the high-speed corners when the rear of the car squats more under load because of that softer suspension. Judging how high to raise it is difficult, so that you have the right balance between the differing ride height demands of low and high-speed corners. Right now, Ferrari is generally fast in the slow-speed corners, but unable to match McLaren's prowess in high-speed corners. So based on the team's hit rate so far this year, Ferrari is struggling to find that ride height sweet spot, especially given that sweet spot moves as the track and weather conditions evolve over a weekend. Statistically speaking, this is a nightmare start to the season for Ferrari. Take away the China sprint, and Ferrari hasn't had a weaker beginning to a season since its pointless start to 2009, when it got F1's new regulations badly wrong. This year, its rivals are racing away in both championships, and it's closer in the points to midfield leader Williams and next best Red Bull, which is a one-car team at the moment, in the Constructors' Championship. But Vasseur thinks the points are hardly reflective of the progress Ferrari has made. One thing he highlights is the difference versus 12 months ago. He estimates Ferrari was 6/10 adrift of then pace-setter Red Bull this time last year, and is now within 2 to 3 tenths of current pace-setter McLaren. Vasseur is right, but then Ferrari had already closed up much of that deficit last year and was neck and neck with both McLaren and Red Bull by the end of the year, creating expectations of maintaining that for 2025 if not pulling ahead. The results don't reflect Ferrari's true 2025 position. Its car is better than the distant fourth best, and so embarrassing errors like the China double disqualification and the nightmare strategy it chose for the wet Melbourne opener have contributed to a highly unrepresentative points tally. It has won a race with this car, and there have been hints of its potential, so much so that McLaren routinely names Ferrari as its biggest competition over Red Bull. But nobody can claim that this was the start to the season that Ferrari wanted. This weekend's return to Bahrain will be a good test for all of the front-running teams, given they'll be able to compare where their cars have evolved from testing 6 weeks prior. The first warning signs of Ferrari's tricky 2025 could be seen in Bahrain testing, where McLaren emerged as the favourite and the Ferrari looked strong at its peak but more inconsistent. Vasseur takes last year's strong in-season development and rise to a position where Ferrari was regularly fighting for wins as a template for this year. For him, it's evidence enough for Ferrari to take the same approach as 2024. There wasn't a magic bullet for Ferrari's progress last year, and Vasseur reckons it will once again be a case of putting together 10 areas that all bring 2 or 3 hundredths worth of improvement. Both drivers are eagerly awaiting forthcoming upgrades, with Leclerc saying we're just not fast enough, and Hamilton believing the pace at Suzuka was all that Ferrari had. There are rumours Ferrari has a floor change it wants to try at Sakir this week. But until the upgrades arrive, better solving the ride height puzzle will be the closest thing Ferrari gets to a magic bullet, especially given that it's so intrinsically linked to driver confidence. Leclerc is seeking confirmation this weekend of a setup change he made on Friday at Suzuka that gave him greater confidence to access the SF25's peak more consistently. He says if the progress that change suggested is validated in Bahrain, then he's confident he'll be able to maximise the car for the rest of the year. For Hamilton, Bahrain will be a test of whether the discrepancy he feels there is between the two cars is resolved. A technical issue on the final day of the test meant Hamilton was denied a proper race simulation, but teammate Leclerc was some way adrift of Lando Norris's McLaren during their race runs on day 2. So Ferrari will head to Bahrain knowing that McLaren is the favourite. But even if it hemorrhages more points to McLaren, it's time for it to start proving it can at least be McLaren's closest challenger and start delivering on some of that pre-season hype.